I have lived and worked in Wyoming for most of my life, and this is the reason why I don't stop on the road over South Pass still to this day. In the early 2000s, I was working on a drilling rig. We changed locations every few weeks, and I traveled all over the state. It was midwinter, and weather conditions were rough. Temperatures of 30 below and 50 miles per hour winds were not uncommon. I was driving from Utah to the northwestern part of the state. It was after sunset and starting to get really dark, when up ahead, on the right side of the road, I saw a little red car pulled over with its emergency lights flashing. I pulled over to see if they needed any help, but there was no one in the car. I called out through the darkness for anyone who might need help, but there was no answer. At that point, I still had hours to drive, so I started walking back to my truck parked just ahead of the red car. I started to hear another car coming up the highway from the south. I thought nothing of it until I heard the car slam on its brakes and come to a screeching stop. I turned around quickly, wondering what the hell was going on. Then, I saw some movement behind the little red car. The car that had locked up their brakes still had their lights on, so all I could make out was the silhouette of a huge bull elk. It began to slowly climb up the embankment and stop between the two cars. I thought that it was an awesome experience at that moment. Then, this thing stood up and walked toward the stopped car. I really didn't know what to think of that. I had never before, or since, seen an elk walk on its hind legs. I'm not sure why, but I started laughing out loud. Just as I started laughing, the car still stopped in the road, put it into gear, spun around, and headed back south. Suddenly it didn't seem so funny anymore. That elk thing looked over its shoulder, turned around toward me, and started to run at me still on its back legs. I spun around and jumped back into my truck, which was luckily still running. I grabbed first gear, and this freaking thing was right at my driver's side window. I floored it. I was going to see just how fast that thing could run. I can still remember that it was right there with me until I hit third gear, about 40, maybe closer to 50 miles per hour in that truck. I pushed it to over 80 and didn't slow down until I had made it to the next town. If you find yourself on the highway over South Pass, don't ever stop. Follow for more horror stories.
Please tell me there is a logical explanation for this, because I'm now scared to go to work. Debunk this. I live in the UK and have been a qualified nurse since 2018. I specialize in stroke and stroke rehabilitation but also work in a private nursing home from time to time to earn some extra money. About 6 months ago a new resident moved into the home, we can call her Jenny, for palliative care for her terminal bowel cancer. Whilst with us, Jenny found out that not only had her bowel cancer spread to her liver and lungs but she also had brain metastases and only had a few months left to live. After about 2 months with us she started really freaking out when we would help her back to her room in the evening and get her comfortable for the night. She used to shout at us to be careful of the children or don't fall in the river. When asked what she was talking about, she explained to us she could see a river flowing through her room and lots of children playing in it. She wasn't necessarily scared of the children, she just didn't want us to stand on them and hurt them. The doctors and nurses all believed that she was hallucinating due to the brain metastasis and the amount of opioid medication she was on, and we all made sure we didn't stand where she was pointing to, so we didn't stand on the children she could see. A couple of months ago Jenny passed away peacefully, and I hadn't thought about the children or the river since. 2 weeks ago, a new resident moved into Jenny's old room. We will call her Sarah. I would like to point out that Sarah didn't live here when Jenny was here. They have never met and nobody would ever have mentioned Jenny to Sarah. Sarah's first week with us passed and she was settling in well until the other night when we tried to take her back to her room for the night and she refused. She said she was not ever going back into that room because she couldn't sleep due to all the noise and she didn't like how close they all got. We asked her what she meant, as the home is very quiet at night, and she said, "Jenny, I froze." I again asked her what she meant and she said, "Jenny and the children make so much noise when they're playing, and it keeps me up all night." I was in absolute shock and have had trouble going in that room since. I've always been a skeptic, but I can't see any other logical explanation for this. I have asked other staff and nobody has mentioned Jenny or the children in the river to Sarah. Somebody please tell me there's another explanation for this.
Former jail deputy saw a ghost at work during night shift. Experience. Disclaimer: I'm not that best storyteller, but I'm not here to dramatize or exaggerate a spooky story either. Just thought I'd give my real experience. Not anything super crazy, but I hope this is the right place to share it. Also TW for anyone sensitive to the topic of someone unaliving themselves. After I graduated last May, I decided to take up a job at my local jail. Nothing long-term, just figured I'd work a year and save up some cash before college. Flash forward a little bit, and I'm only a few weeks into training. I've always liked the idea that ghosts really existed, but at that point, I really couldn't say I ever actually saw one. However, that all changed while taking post one night. The time was a little after 5 a.m., and I was sitting behind my desk, absolutely bored to tears. So, being a good little deputy, I was spinning around in my chair, honestly trying not to fall asleep. Now, to give you a little visual of where I am, I'm in a big giant room with a bunch of cells. At one end of the room is the officer's desk with big windows behind it. These windows are super reflective, so officers can look into the pod from the hallway, but inmates can't look out into the hallway from inside the pod. At the other end of this pod are all the cells. This particular pod has some cells that were behind a second pane of glass. Still with me? Because this is important, I promise. Anyways, I'm spinning around in my chair at my desk, and happen to glance up at the reflective windows behind the desk. As I do, some movement catches my eye upstairs. There is someone walking around upstairs, out of their cell, but behind the glass. I stare at disbelief for a moment, and instantly freak the fuck out. I'm thinking somewhere along the lines of holy fucking shit, who the hell is out of their cell at this hour? Aw man, my ass is fucking grass, man. I quickly turn around and see no one up there. I scramble and check the monitor that gives me control of the cell's doors and make sure all of them are locked, which they are. I even go up there myself and make sure everything is as secure as can be. Somewhere in the middle me making sure I'm not about to get fired, it dawned on me. That was a motherfucking ghost. There was no mistaking it. I 1000% saw someone up there. Now, I don't mean I saw a quick little shadow or a suspicious looking speckle of dust. No, I was distinctly looking at someone in an orange jumpsuit walking around up there. I could tell you this guy's haircut, his height, general build, and even what kind of beard he had. To be honest, I was totally banking on this happening at some point. I mean, for my first day, I could tell that place was uber haunted. So I immediately get my corporal on the horn and tell her excitedly that I saw a ghost. But things don't end there. After that, I was bragging to anyone and everyone about my little encounter with some mixed reactions. My sergeant says he doesn't really believe in ghosts, but some deputies told me they've definitely seen some paranormal stuff on duty too. However, it's what the sergeant on day shift shared that has really stuck with me. He told me that they had an inmate commit suicide in that same pod a few years prior. I had already been told that by a few people who've been there a while. I gave a description of the guy I saw, and we decided to look up the inmate just to see if they looked the same. It was him. It was definitely the guy I saw walking around upstairs. Right down to his skinny face and the billy goat beard, there was no mistaking it. I've talked to some inmates about it, and I've had more than one tell me that sometimes they can hear someone walk by their cells and peeking in at the late hours of the night. It can't be a correctional officer they're talking about, because they're always wearing an orange jumpsuit. Well, that's my spooky experience. I didn't really have any notable encounters after that, but I'd be happy to answer any questions any of you might have. But I hope you found this interesting.
Casting out demons, demonic activity. Hello again. I got some people asking for the follow-up to the demonic dreams thread from the other day, so I figured I would oblige. Like I had previously said, I texted my pastor the day after the dream in which I was possessed in the church. He texted me during the school day asking me if I was free and if he could pick me up so we could go talk to a woman in our church. We'll call this woman the discerner. Mostly because it was well known in our church that this woman specifically was able to discern, bind, and cast out demonic entities that attach themselves to Christians. So my pastor and I reached the discerner's home, and her kids have conveniently gone out for the day, leaving her, her husband, myself, and my pastor in the home. It was a beautiful day, perfectly sunny with a light breeze, not a hint of rain in the sky, so we found ourselves sitting outside on her deck for about 30 minutes discussing seemingly mundane changes in my lifestyle choices. At this point I was very much simply giving in to my base urges in life, stealing things I wanted, making a fool of myself to get a cheap laugh, acting in a very sinful manner with my lustful urges, and being an arrogant little jerky. However, this was a marked change from what people knew of or expected of me, and the discerner mused that it may be from the entity itself, pushing me to make worse and worse decisions to satisfy that thrill. After that lovely discussion we decided to move inside to have some drinks and a prayer session before we started with the actual process of naming, binding, and casting out demonic presences from my life. Nothing extraordinary happened at this point, but I just felt this clench in my gut, a fight or flight instinct that was only stifled by the firm grips of the two men sitting on either side of me. I wanted out of there, and fast. I felt trapped, and started spiraling into an anxiety attack unlike any I've had before or since. I must have physically reacted in some way because the two men stiffened and firmed their grip on my hands to help hold me in place. By the time the prayer had ended, the skies outside went from a beautiful blue without a hint of clouds to a dark gray, almost black, storm head that had seemingly rolled in out of nowhere. The discerner looked me in the eyes and asked if I was ready, so I nodded. The process was simple. She would run through a list of sins, wicked spirits that she discerned, and I would confirm or deny whether I felt their presence in my life. Once the spirit was discerned, she would call out its name, bind it in Christ's name, and cast it out in Christ's name. Pretty standard Christian spirituality, honestly. So we go through some wicked spirits, and every time we cast one out I feel a physical weight being lifted off my shoulders. Nothing super interesting was happening, honestly, though the storm outside was building up in an odd crescendo of sorts. That was when we got to the final spirit to be named during this session, Pride. For those of you unfamiliar with Judeo-Christian mythos, lore, there is a singular entity who represents the epitome of pride, Lucifer, God's premier angel and the one who sought to ascend to the same status than God himself. Pride is one of the 7 deadly sins and is often the downfall of man, and most sin roots can be traced all the way back to pride in some way. Well, it was determined that I happened to have a very powerful, wicked, and malicious entity directly tied to pride. At the mention of this entity, my entire body tensed up and involuntarily shut my eyes in preparation for what was about to happen. The discerner noticed, and quickly set about calling out this entity. What happened next is the most unexplainable thing I've ever had happen to me. In my mind's eye I saw, very vividly mind you, a pair of bright green cat-slit eyes. As we prayed and began to bind this entity, I saw the eyes begin to smolder with anger, a face forming around these bright eyes that was the epitome of rage. When we finally got to casting out the entity in Christ's name, the face itself began to burn up as if it were being thrown into a fiery furnace, and was sucked down some sort of tube, disappearing entirely from my mind. My body went limp, and my pastor was sitting there with his mouth hanging open, as was the discerner's husband. The discerner opened her eyes and looked at everyone and just said, "Did everyone see that?" We had all experienced the exact same vision of those eyes turning into a rage-filled face before being cast out into the fires of hell. I didn't get a chance to mention it before she brought it up, and she described it exactly as I saw it. After that, the storm rolled through quickly, 3 minutes max, while we finished up in prayer and exhortation. I stood up and felt like an entirely different person. The world seemed a lot more vivid and bright, and I was suddenly aware of my emotional status again. I realized I had fallen into utter apathy and depression during that season of demonic oppression. It would be 5 years until I had my next fight with demonic entities. If y'all want to hear about the wild college stories, let me know.
My dad and I were surrounded by a group of creatures while camping. We've never talked about it since it happened. What do you think they were? My dad was a bit of a nut, a survivalist, ready for anything. He often took me camping when I was growing up. The saddest part of it all is that we never went camping again after that night. We hiked out a couple miles to a clearing where we'd camped before. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Then the sun went down. That's when the howling started. Dad said it was coyote calls. I was excited to experience it since they weren't common in that area yet. As we listened, the howls grew deeper and more menacing. They drew in closer. Their voices came from all around the clearing. I was getting a little nervous, but Dad was stoic as ever. After a few minutes, the howls died down. Dad threw a log on the fire. As the ring of light grew, we could see sets of eyes all around us. Some were low to the ground, but some were 5 or 6 feet in the air. Dad wasn't worried. He had his gun after all. He always said, shoot first and ask questions later. His demeanor changed when the laughter started. If you've ever seen African hyenas on TV, you can imagine the sound. One by one, we could hear whatever they were laughing all around us. Dad drew his weapon. I'll never forget the look on his face. I've never seen him afraid of anything. His face was pure terror. He fired once in the air to scare them off. Their laughter stopped. The glowing eyes disappeared into the darkness. But a couple minutes later, the laughter resumed. We couldn't see them anymore, but they were close. Dad fired a few more times. Each time, they retreated and returned. Now and then, we could hear something rush toward our camp, but they never came into view. This went on for hours. When the sky began to brighten, they slowly departed. When the sun was high enough, we broke camp and got out of there. The car ride home was silent. The next day, I asked Dad what those animals were. He said, coyotes. He refused to speak of the incident again after that.